Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are based, depending on your time zone. Thank you so much for being with us today. Welcome to e-commerce opportunities in Brazil, why and how to go to market. My name is Lindsay Lear. I'm with America's Market Intelligence, and I'm very excited to be working with PayU today to bring you this webinar. We're going to be exploring the opportunities, challenges, and different strategies on selling online in Brazil. And I'm just thrilled that you all are here and that we are launching this webinar. I'm going to take a moment to introduce my co-host. I'm going to turn it over right now to Marcos Marins of PayU.
Hi, everybody. My name is Marcos Marins. I'm in charge of PayU Brazil for the past 3 years. My experience has been always in finance and payment segments. I have more than 25 years experience in banking payments. I've been working at Itaú Unibanco, which is one of the biggest banks in the country, also Rede, which is one of the biggest acquirers, and Mercado Libre. And I was born in Rio de Janeiro, the Olympic city, but I've been living in São Paulo for the past 13 years.
Okay, great. And Martin, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Martin Schrimpf. I've been in payments for the last 14 years, very focused in the LATAM market. But the last couple of years, I've been very focused on global sales. So I manage everything. I head the global sales department for PayU in that sense.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to give a really brief overview of how this webinar is going to work today. Myself, Marcos, and Martin will be presenting the content. We'll do a first really brief introduction into our two firms and then dive into the content. And at the end of the webinar, we're going to try to keep this to an hour. At the end, we're going to have a live question and answer session. So if you look at to everyone on the line, if you look at your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a little tab that says questions. And we really want the audience to be interactive. You are able to, there in the question tab, ask your questions as they arise throughout the content. We have our other PayU colleague, Shelly Purcell, behind the scenes managing the questions, and then we'll see her later at the end when we address them live. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump into some introductions here, give you guys an idea a little bit about AMI. I'm the Senior Director of the Payments Vertical at AMI. We are a consulting firm focused specifically on helping companies grow in Latin America. So we work with clients who want to be more competitive, who want to understand their markets, and improve their strategy in the region. Our headquarters is in Miami. I am based in San Francisco, and we also have, as you can see from the map, we have coverage all over Latin America. In terms of our industry experience, payments is our largest industry, and really I've been heavily focused over the past 24 months on everything digital, e-commerce, m-commerce, mobile payments, financial inclusion, etc., and have really been very invested in helping merchants understand how to go to market in Latin America, and specifically Brazil, which is the largest market and is the first market that merchants tend to ask about. So we've developed a lot of resources, and that's kind of the motivation behind this webinar today. And I'll turn it over to you guys to give us an overview of PayU.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah. If you want, just go to the next slide. Very briefly, we don't want to cover you too much information about PayU, but PayU is the leading payment service provider, really focused on emerging markets. Currently, we cover 16 markets, and we really play a different game to most global PSPs or payment service providers, in the fact that we really act locally. So just so you get an idea, we're about 2,000 employees, headquartered in Amsterdam, and in our headquarters we have less than 20 employees. I mean, it's really spread around. So very strong in India, very strong in Russia and Turkey and Africa. And as you know, as we're covering LATAM today, I mean, we have about 500 people in LATAM. Just in Brazil, Marcos Marin's team is approximately close to 200 people. So it's really, really what we call multi-local, and that's the kind of the approach that we do. And if we go to the next slide, just briefly to Lindsay, we basically have more than 14 years experience in the different markets that we operate. We are more than 200,000 merchants kind of are with us, or with the platform. And one important thing quickly just to say there too is like we have more than 250 payment options connected to PayU, and we don't use any third-party PSP or someone in between. So we've really actually gone to each of the local markets, set up legal entities, understand the market, and then connected directly to the payment method. So 250 payment methods connected directly to us has been a titanic job, but it also means that we offer the best kind of levels of approval rate, and we're closer to the payment methods to really maximize and improve that experience. So that's a very brief overview of who we are.
Okay, great, terrific. Okay, I'm gonna jump right into the content here, but before I do so, I'd love to hear from the audience a little bit, just to make sure that you guys are engaged. If you go to your little question button on your pane, I'd love for you guys to just to tell us where you're joining us from. If you are, you know, the city or country or state that you're joining us from. Let's see if, oh, okay, we've got San Francisco, Los Angeles, a lot of West Coasters, nice and early for you guys. Thanks for joining. A couple people from Miami. So it looks like most of us are in the US, North America. Okay, awesome. Cool. Great. All right, so that's some good background. I'm glad to know that everyone is kind of, most of us are coming from a North American context. That's good to know. If we start looking at these slides here, I'm just going to start by setting the stage about Brazil. Now, many of you may already be knowledgeable about Latin America. Many of you may be considering Brazil for the first time. But certainly, as I'm sure everyone is aware, Brazil is a major global player. In the past 5 years, it's really emerged as a market to take very seriously in a global strategy. It's 6th largest economy in the world, 10th largest country for e-commerce sales. It's really an important market when we think about growth coming from emerging markets. It's a middle income country, and most importantly, Brazilians are early technology adopters. They are highly social. They're highly connected to social media. You know, we've got very high levels of smartphone penetration. And they are voracious consumers with a big appetite for imported goods, electronics, digital goods, online content. You can see some of the numbers here. Compared globally, Brazil, you know, at $23 billion is definitely the largest player in Latin America, making up about 60% of the region. Latin America as a whole is about $60 billion in e-commerce. And so Brazil also works not only of its own right, but it's a very good springboard off into the rest of Latin America, because from Brazil, which is arguably one of the more complicated markets to go into, you can then, you know, through a partner such as PayU or others, jump into neighboring markets, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, that have smaller, yet, you know, when you look at the region as a whole, important impact and contribution to e-commerce. Looking a little bit more in detail at what e-commerce looks like in Brazil, you know, pretty standard for the industry. We've got retail taking up about 50% of total sales. And if you look at the product categories, we have, you know, fashion and cosmetics, the #1. Brazilians are famous for really loving and consuming in high volumes cosmetics, personal care products, fashion, jewelry, etc. We also see a lot of high-ticket items, electronics, home furnishings. Especially, Brazilians tend to really love anything imported. Anything that they can find outside of Brazil has a special prestige, and there's a big demand for cross-border e-commerce. One category that we unfortunately don't have as detailed information is digital goods and services, which is especially important for international merchants because Brazil is, as I mentioned, online. They're very connected and they want to engage internationally. This is a new product category across the region, and there isn't too much data into how it breaks down by type, but we know that it's growing rapidly as more and more international and local apps and different mobile services start to gain traction. So, this is just giving us an idea of which product categories are the largest and which are set to grow the fastest, just showcasing some of those opportunities. Um, but of course, I've talked already about how exciting the Brazilian economy is for e-commerce, but we certainly must recognize the situation that the country finds itself in today. Brazil has been in the headlines a lot in the past year. Its president was just impeached. It's going through the worst recession that it's experienced in the past 60 or 70 years. And this slide really tells the Brazil story. At the top left, we see GDP growth, 2016 really bottoming out at, negative 4% growth, which is very unfortunate. A lot of Brazilians are suffering right now. High unemployment, high inflation, high levels of indebtedness. And their currency has fallen significantly over the past 18 months. But what's very exciting simultaneously is that if you look at this bottom graph, bottom left, the bar chart, e-commerce, despite the turmoil that the economy is experiencing, e-commerce is growing consistently year over year. It is still growing this year in 2016 at a rate of about 13%. So Brazil is resilient. And while some of the more traditional sectors of the economy are contracting right now, e-commerce and everything related to the digital transformation is still growing at pretty decent rates. Marcos, I think you're in Brazil, you're in Sao Paulo. Tell us a little bit about what your experience has looked like this year in Brazil, given the whole situation.
Thank you, Lindsay. What I can say is, yes, Brazilians are resilient. In fact, we have faced some turbulence in the political arena that led us to a huge recession, maybe the worst recession ever. As a result, our previous president faced an impeachment process, and currently we have a new president, who is Michel Temer. It's important to say that despite the complex situation, institutions in Brazil have worked nicely. After all, Brazilians believe that this bad situation will help the country to get rid of the bad politicians, and eventually our economy will resume to grow strongly again. By the way, we have seen some signs, strong signs, that the economy is starting to get traction. I just would like to outline that despite all bad things, e-commerce, as you said, has grown by 20% in the past 5 years and expects to grow by 13% by December 2016. Just to finalize, my view is that those who are paving the road right now will be in a very good position when the turbulence is over.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Marcos, what you said about, everything moving upwards from this point on. The whole region has GDP has kind of bottomed out middle of this year, July about this year, and we're going to see continued growth in all sectors of the economy from here on out. So we have a lot of reason to be optimistic about Brazil, especially in the digital channels. Great. So let's take a look a little bit at e-commerce versus mobile commerce. E-commerce, as we can see on the red line here, growth is starting to decelerate, and that is due to a number of factors. This year specifically, we had some economic challenges. The average ticket grew in 2015 as the number of transactions almost stagnated. And that tells us that people with lower incomes sort of dropped out of the market a little bit for e-commerce. Lower middle class and lower class folks who are particularly pinched during economic recession kind of dropped out of the market a little bit this year. But slowing growth is also simply a sign of a maturing market. E-commerce has been growing strong in the region for the past 10 years. On the other hand, what is very exciting is the fact that sales via mobile, as we can see, grew almost 90% in Brazil. And that's really very exciting, especially for international merchants who, mobile is going to be the main vehicle for delivering your goods and services. And this is really indicative of where the market is going to go from here, and really a good hint at how merchants ought to focus their strategy. Marcos, did you have any comments on this slide? I think you could offer
Yes.
some good Brazilian insight.
Thank you, Lindsay. What I would like to add here is that the population in Brazil is about 200 million people, but we have over 267 mobile connections. And 50% of these mobile connections are smartphones. So the total number of active mobile users are approximately 100 million people, which is a huge number, and of course brings a huge opportunity. Another interesting data is that mobile commerce in US is around 30% of all e-commerce transactions. And if you look at Brazil in particular, this percentage is only 15%, which suggests there is a huge space to grow.
Absolutely.
I
Okay,
wanted to,
I'd like,
Lindsay,
yeah, go
sorry,
for
just
it.
add to, but it's actually interesting because e-commerce in Brazil is by far higher, the actual e-commerce portion, than the rest of Latin America. And I think there's a lot of reasons behind it, probably because 15 years ago it was a kind of a more closed market. But the interesting side is even if you see the e-commerce trends, probably because of the economic issues, certain e-commerce players are growing dramatically fast. So to give you an example, AliExpress and Alibaba, basically, which is the arm of that, has just been shooting up dramatically in Brazil. And I think Brazil is one of its most interesting markets in general. So when you have countries that are sort of in recession or just coming out and they don't have that, sometimes there's opportunities for specific e-commerce players to really dramatically grow. And that's what we've seen here. It's growing at a faster pace than they would have anticipated. So if you have,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think that's a great point, Martin. I mean, especially like you said, especially in times of recession when people are looking to source things for cheaper, oftentimes what you can find on the international market is going to be cheaper than what you find in Brazil. So more
exactly.
and more people are looking outside their own borders to find cheaper products.
Correct. Exactly that point.
Great. Okay, I'd like to, I have a poll that just to get everyone's attention, make sure no one has fallen asleep on us. I'd love for the audience to answer a question for me. I'd like to really understand what vertical you're operating in if you're a merchant. So I'm going to launch a poll here, and if you guys can all answer on your screens. Wait a few seconds for everyone to answer. Okay, we're almost there. Keep them coming in. Okay, great. Got almost everyone. So let's take a look at the results. Okay. All right. So we've got several people joining who are not a merchant. That's great. Kind of coming from different backgrounds. Digital goods, as I expected, we kind of have a higher than average disproportionate participation on digital goods and zero physical goods. Interesting. Okay. Great. Okay. I'm going to jump back in here. So just the main, what I'd like to really drive home in this section of the presentation is that, oops, let me just make sure everyone is seeing the presentation only. There we go. What I really want to drive home here is that Brazil is, as Martin said, really disproportionate in Latin America. It's a market to take very seriously if you are considering a global strategy. Right now, Brazil is struggling a little bit, but even so, e-commerce has performed very well. International merchants who are thinking about penetrating Brazil, it might, maybe if they're feeling reluctant because of the economic situation, it may be wise to hold off, kind of think about the next 12 months as you developing a strategy for Brazil as you gear up to hit the market. And merchants who are in the market now or who are planning to go into the market now in the short term really must have a robust and targeted mobile strategy so that your sales are aligning, so that your strategy is aligning to where the market is headed. Kind of main takeaways from that section. Okay, I just want to make sure that everyone's seeing the slide I'm on. I am on Brazil's local payment system. Is that okay? Can my organizers confirm that that's what everyone is seeing?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So we're going to kind of move into the next phase here of the presentation, which is really what I'm really excited about and what AMI has been focused on helping merchants learn, and where PayU here really can offer some excellent insight. Now, I'm going to be using the term quite a bit, cross-border versus local, and many of you probably understand what that means. I'm just going to really make it clear so that we're all on the same page. A cross-border transaction is one that is captured by an international acquirer. Okay, so even if it's transacted in Brazilian currency, even if it's on a localized website, if you're using a bank in the United States or outside of Brazil, that's considered a cross-border transaction. And here we have some examples of global acquirers you may be familiar with. Now, if your transaction is processed through a Brazilian acquirer, we've got Cielo and Hedge being the two most important, JetNet and Stone, some up-and-coming acquirers in Brazil, then your transaction is going to be considered local, whether or not you as a merchant are physically in Brazil or not. Okay, so those are the definitions we're going to be working with. And the whole message that I really want to communicate here is that it's very important for a successful e-commerce strategy in Brazil to have a local payment strategy, because transacting your sales using a cross-border approach really isn't ideal. And I'm going to explain why. Okay, if you guys take away any slide of this presentation, this is really the one that I want you to pay close attention to. Cross-border sales via e-commerce only scratches the tip of the iceberg in Brazil, and there are many reasons why. The local banking system and the local payment system is quite different than in the United States, and it's merchants, when they approach me, merchants all over Silicon Valley approach me and ask me to explain this to them, because some of the concepts are very strange, and if you've never had international experience, it can be very daunting. There's 4 main points here. First off, in Brazil, all purchases made in a foreign currency are subject to a 6% financial operations tax. Now, Brazilians are used to paying all sorts of taxes, and 6% isn't a lot, but it's an extra burden placed on your consumers that we want to avoid if possible. Secondly, only 20% of credit cards issued in Brazil are actually enabled for international purchases. Okay, so if you go to the bank, you go to Banco Itaú and you want to get a credit card, unless it's a very premium card and you are an affluent person, that card is not necessarily going to allow you to make purchases on Amazon, on Victoria's Secret, on any merchant in the US because of the rules of the issuing bank. Excuse me. And this is something that kind of is surprising, because in the US economy, the banking system doesn't work that way. So if you're coming from a cross-border approach, you are automatically excluding 80% of Brazilian credit cards, which is obviously a very significant chunk of the market. Number 3, non-card payments, which we also call alternative payments, make up about 25% of all e-commerce sales in Brazil. And this is very different from the US. Brazil has different payment methods other than credit cards, which we'll get into in detail, that really fulfill a market niche and a market need that merchants need to be aware of. And finally, in number 4, this is perhaps one of the more significant ones, 60% of all e-commerce sales are purchased through an installment plan, special installment plans that are made available only by Brazilian acquirers. So the only way to offer these promotions and these plans to your customers is by being connected to the local acquirers on the ground. So if we look at the bar chart on the bottom, what we see is that cross-border e-commerce is $4 billion in Brazil compared to a $19 billion domestic market. And so if a merchant, if you are approaching Brazil with a cross-border strategy, you are forfeiting 80% of the addressable market. You're forfeiting that $19 billion of domestic e-commerce, which is clear, which is obvious. That's huge. That's huge, and most merchants don't understand this. And Brazil is such a big and dynamic market. If you're going to invest in a Brazilian strategy, you really need to make sure that you're leveraging the entire consumer base possible. So that's a lot of information. We're going to break it down a little bit, and we're happy to answer questions regarding this. But I'm going to move on to the next slide here to discuss a little bit of Brazil's local payment landscape. If we look at the bar, if we look at the chart on the right here, this is how Brazilian e-commerce sales break down by payment type. And as I mentioned, Brazil has some special and unique payment types. Really, if you're an international merchant processing outside of Brazil, you're only going to be able to access those international credit cards, which is only 22% of the market. Okay, domestic credit cards are about 50%, and this triangle of 23% represents boleto bancário. Okay, so I'm going to do another poll here, just to kind of figure out how many people are familiar, how familiar people are with Brazil's local landscape. So I'm going to launch this poll. Okay, the question is, how familiar are you with boleto bancário? Okay, their answers are coming in. Keep them coming. Okay, great. I'm going to share the results here. Okay, so we've got a good split. A lot of people are familiar with it. Some, okay, so some people know about it but don't really know how it works, and a few people don't boleto what? Okay, so that's great. So let's take a moment to explain this. Oops, hide results. Okay. I'm gonna go. Okay. So boleto bancário it's a very important payment instrument in Brazil. It's a cash-based invoice issued by banks at the request of a merchant. And so if I'm going online, I go to Magazine Luiza, a very popular retailer in Brazil, and I want to make a payment using boleto bancário. I select the payment method, print out a voucher, and then take that voucher to a bank or to another location to pay in cash. So it's a cash-based payment method that, a lot of North American merchants say, oh, that's not very efficient. That's going to screw up my supply chain, my fulfillment. But for better or for worse, it's a very important part of the Brazilian payment system, representing 25% of total sales, 23%. And more importantly, it's the only payment method that Brazilians who don't have a bank account can use. 50 million Brazilians do not have a bank account or any other way to access your online store. So it's a very important instrument to access a broader customer base. Marcos, do you have any comments about boleto bancário, how important it is, on a daily basis?
You explained pretty well, Lindsay. And in fact, it's exactly like this. So it's part of our culture. Everybody here in Brazil uses boleto a lot. I have to use boleto to pay my condominium, the schools of my children. So, and when we want to buy online, and we, the amount of the purchase is high, people prefer to use boleto because they feel more secure by doing that. So it's
secure,
pretty much parts of our culture here in Brazil.
Yeah, that's another important issue. A lot of times in Latin America, it happens all over the region, people are very fearful of using their credit card online. And so boleto gives them gives them more security and it acts as an incentive to actually buy online.
Yeah. I wanted to add also that even though it's 25% that shows that's boleto bancário, that's the overall kind of e-commerce and all the transactions. The interesting things, and I see that from this, the audience, there's quite a big amount of digital goods. When you go into digital goods in other spaces, boleto bancário can be a lot bigger. Like we process a lot for gaming merchants, from like literally on video games and online games, and we see that for that specific segment, boleto bancário can be up to 75–80% of the overall transactions, because it's targeting a segment of probably younger audience that don't have a credit card. So it really depends on the segment how popular it is. When you're thinking of digital goods, boleto bancário becomes a lot more important. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that.
That's really interesting. Okay, very cool. Okay, just to give the audience a little bit of a taste of what some international merchants are doing in Brazil. These are three very well-known merchants. We've got Groupon, selling online coupons, Spotify, sorry that image is a little bit blurry, but online streaming, and a more traditional physical goods, Adidas. And you can see, signs that these merchants are processing locally and offering local payment methods. For Groupon, you can see Elo, which is a local Brazilian credit card network. Down here at the bottom, we've got Boleto. We've also got bank transfers with all the local banks. Spotify is currently accepting only credit card transactions, but they've got three major Brazilian cards here that are offered, only accessible if you are processing locally in Brazil. And also in Adidas, we see, here at the bottom right, they've got their Boleto Bancário logo. So even Adidas as well is offering Boleto. This is what a payment formula might look like.
I just would like to add that, for example, Elo, which is a domestic network, is becoming bigger in Brazil and now accounts for almost 12% of the share of credit cards in Brazil, which is very big. Mm-hmm. So this is an example how important it is to acquire locally in Brazil.
Absolutely. Yes. And then, one final point here is parcelamento, which is a huge, this is huge. Parcelamento, and this is common throughout Latin America. Basically, it refers to interest-free installment plans, which are a cornerstone of the Brazilian shopping experience. And I put those in quotes, interest-free.
Yes. You're getting a lot of interference, I don't know, from your side or something.
Oh, really? Okay. Let me try to check my headset here. Should be okay. Is that any better?
No, I think it might be your headset.
Okay. Let's see here. Can you guys hear me okay?
No.
No.
Maybe try without the headset.
Okay, how about that? Is that
okay? Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Okay, and if I break out again, please let me know. So anyway, going back to parcelamento, this is a very important component of Brazilian e-commerce, and this creates a lot of insecurity and doubts among merchants who want to understand Brazil. Basically, acquirers make this option available to merchants for varying fees, based financing, and then merchants make that option available to their customers at the point of sale. And customers can choose to finance their purchases from 3 up to 12, sometimes up to 24 installments, interest-free. Now, that financial cost is built into the final cost of the product. So even if you're paying for it up front, you're in essence paying for the price of installments. But this has become so common that Brazilians are used to, and they expect to pay, 12-month interest-free installment plan for goods priced as low as $40. And we have some examples here. Down at the bottom, this Nike shirt we see down at the very small text at the bottom, you can pay for that in 10 installments, interest-free. And so people are both in the physical world and in e-commerce are very used to this. And it does take a little bit of getting used to for merchants. You have to play with your financing, and you have to sometimes adapt your payment model if you're a digital good to be able to accommodate this. But again, in 2015, these installment plans represented 60% of e-commerce sales. So it is huge, or equal to $13 billion. And I know you guys, if you guys could just speak a little bit about how important this is to Brazilian culture, Brazilian shopping culture, and the expectation of consumers.
I would like to add here that installments in Brazil is really part of our culture. It comes from the 80s when the country was facing hyperinflation, but this is another story. The main point here is that installments may seem a bit weird at first glance, but what any international merchant should know is that it can boost your sales or kill your business. So you'd better consider it as part of your approach in the country, because it's really important for Brazilian consumers.
Okay, great. Fantastic. So just really quick, the key takeaways here, for all of these reasons, it's crucial to replicate in as much as you can the Brazilian payment experience. E-commerce is so competitive in Brazil. If your payment experience isn't friendly and easy to use and familiar to Brazilians, they're likely to go buy the same product on a competitor's website where they feel comfortable, they're familiar, they have the payment method, and they can pay in the way that they prefer. And if you're not doing that, you're really just excluding yourself from a very huge market. So this is really the key message. Now the next step is, great, I understand, I want to process locally. How do I do it? How do I do it? Who are the payment providers that can help me do it? And what are the implications? So we're going to move into that. Before we do, I'd like to do another poll for the audience. I have this question here. Some of you are not merchants, so I apologize for that, but this just to get a sense of where the audience is at in terms of considering Brazil as a place to do business for e-commerce. Okay, they're coming in. We've got some answers. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, so interesting. So none of the folks in our audience today have a local entity in Brazil. So this content might be very relevant. So starting to consider Brazil as a market of interest, want to sell into Brazil, learning how to do it. I'm very happy to hear that. Hopefully this will all be a good resource for you. And we're going to get into right now, the challenges of going to Brazil, but also all of the options that merchants have when they do it. So let me get back here. All right, so right at this point, I'm going to turn it over to PayU for you guys to talk specifically about the Brazilian experience, how going local is done, and what are the different options that merchants have.
You're mute, Marcos, quickly. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. So yes, doing business in Brazil is not easy. We do have a complex and expensive regulation that makes the scenario scary at the first glance. However, despite all sorts of problems, I could give you hundreds of good examples on how a company can be successful in the country. Instead, I'm going to give you some data to explain why you must come to Brazil. First, Brazil is the 8th largest GDP across the globe, which is very important. We are internet-heavy users. 76% of internet users access internet every day, logging on for an average of 5 hours on weekdays and 4.5 hours on weekends. Lastly, it was already said here, cross-border sales represent only 17% of all e-commerce in Brazil, which gives an impressive addressable market of $19 billion. So it's a very important reason to be considered. On the top, you can see the general flow to start processing locally. One, you have to register with your local tax authority, open a Brazilian bank account, and hire a payment gateway. This is the standard flow, but we have other flavors to present you. The next slide, please. What I can say here is that we have created an expertise over the years on how to do cross-border in the country. We have been supported and spent a lot of money to understand how to do that. So we are supported by the most renowned legal offices and local banks in order to make this process as simple as possible. What I can say is that depending on the merchant's target, segment of business, products, etc., we can provide the best solution for each need. I would like to add that we have served dozens of merchants for the past years, and we have a full solution for those who want to do cross-border in the country. I don't know if Martin wants to add something.
Sure. Look, I think it's very interesting from the polls that Lindsay did and we saw from the audience here. None of you have a legal entity, and all of you are kind of, well, a big portion of you are exploring and going to Brazil. It's very normal to think, okay, I would like to get those access to the payment methods that we described, but there's no way I'm going to start really thinking about setting up a legal entity and going there. I mean, there's a lot of challenges. One is, you need to know Portuguese, you need to have people on the ground, you need to set up a local legal entity. I mean, we know that that's a big point and a barrier to entry. So we've actually, as PayU, we've invested a lot of time and effort, as Marcos is describing. We took 2 years exploring with the top lawyers of how we could actually service global merchants, give them access to the local payment methods, and then take the money out for them without them having to have a local legal entity. So I think the main, apart from giving a good context of Brazil, the main takeaway here, at least on the PayU side, is you can try Brazil without having to go into the burden of having to go and set up a local legal entity. Now, there are certain things, and depending on the industry that you're in, you might have withholding tax or not. Some industries don't have any withholding tax. So we would have to explore in the case of each of you, if there isn't withholding tax. But it kind of simplifies the game dramatically to be able to access and get access to Boleto, Arcadios, and to Elo and Hipercar. That's the key point, that you really can, players like us, and there are other players in the market that just specialize in really trying to help global merchants enter, have local payments without them having a local legal entity.
Awesome. I think that's such an exciting message. Merchants are very confused on that point, and very few people are aware of the alternatives. That's a great point to really drive home.
Great. And so I think to finalize, at least from the PayU side, we wanted to give two case studies, very brief case studies, of international merchants that don't have a local legal entity, and how we're working with them to really grow their business. So the first one's Open English. Some of you might have heard of it, some of you might not. If you're in the US, you probably haven't heard of it, but it's actually a US company based out of Miami, focusing on giving online courses just of English, and they basically put teachers together with students in Latin America. They've been incredibly successful, raised a huge amount of money, and they're probably the most renowned brand in Latin America, lots of advertising on TV. And they were having challenges in Brazil, because initially they were just doing everything cross-border with an acquirer in the US. And then we started to work, and they saw two very big benefits. One is the approval rate actually went up. Not only did they have more access to other credit cards, but the general approval rates, this is a recurring model, they do recurring payments for this. And the approval rate of the first and the second, so the first time transaction is normally a lower approval rate, but the second one were higher than if they were doing it with a local acquirer in the US. And that's just because us doing acquiring in Brazil means that we have more information about the user in general. We know the risks of fraud higher because we're closer to the market. And the acquirers, as they see it as a local transaction, they have less risk rules in place that allows you to have better approval rates. So one side was really seeing how the approval rate went up in credit card transactions. But the other interesting side, even though they're a recurring revenue business model and they charge like a monthly fee, they expanded also into cash payments with Boleto Bancario. And a model like that, you would expect to be zero nearly on cash payments. And even with them, they got about an 8 to 10% uplift. People actually paying or prepaying a yearly subscription to their services and using Boleto Bancario. So interesting side of how they've really actually passed all their traffic from a US acquirer to us in that sense to handle it directly in Brazil, and their growth has been quite dramatical because of that. And then the other business case, if you want to pass to the next slide, Lindsay, is a very, very big gaming merchant, one of the biggest in the world, very successful. That's brought out lots of very good titles that have actually succeeded. And they were doing everything cross-border before, so everything was being processed by a U.S. acquirer. And what happened was, in the year 2013, the acquirers in Brazil came together and said, wait a sec, these guys are sending transactions in Brazilian reals for our consumers to pay in Brazilian reals, and these transactions are not going for any of the local acquirers. So the banks basically came together and said, actually, no, these transactions, if they're in Brazilian reals, they should come through us. And what happened was that literally from one day to another, anyone who was doing cross-border and sending the transaction value in Brazilian reals, the approval rate went down from about 75% to 25%. So it really dramatically killed the business. And the only way you could recover that, if you wanted to keep on charging in Brazilian reals, was to go and do local acquiring, which is what we kind of do for them. So they switched to us. They started doing local acquiring. Not only that, they got access to boleto bancario. And this example doesn't even include the boleto bancario part, but it really shows that even though they had to go for the burden of connecting to a new provider, which was us, and doing the transactions there, they even then incremented about 5 basis points on the actual approval rate, which is a good amount, a 5% increase on the approval rate there too. So this is just an example of what could have happened to you in the past. Maybe some of you already lived that experience. But the only way, if you want to process in local currency, which is an important factor, just as Lindsay was saying before, people want to feel comfortable, they want to know what they're paying. If you want to process in local currency, you have to really do local acquiring there. Otherwise, you won't maximize that approval rate.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating when you look at the incremental increases in sales that merchants experience by integrating locally. I mean, the very first step is simply seeing your approval rates go up. Even if you're not necessarily looking at the local payment methods yet, your approval rate's going to go up. Then you have a bump in sales because, oh, look, I can access all of these credit cards that I didn't access before. Then you're going to have another bump because all of a sudden you're able to offer cash payments, boleto bancario. And then you may even have an additional bump because now you're able to offer installments and your product is now affordable to a segment that it wasn't affordable to before. So these are great case studies. I've heard many of them, and merchants just watch their sales go up and up as they tackle each separate issue that they do in Brazil.
Very true.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that, Martin. I think that was really enlightening. So we're getting towards the end of our information here. I'd like to do one last poll, just to kind of get a sense of where we're at with our audience. So we're just both PayU and AMI would really love to know, what are you most interested in learning about in Brazil? We've got some options here. Maybe it's something else. Let's see what people are thinking. Okay. Anyone else? Get your vote in. All right. This question has the highest percent of listener participation. Still coming in. Great. Let's take a look. Okay, taxes. That's no surprise to me. That's a very common question. And Brazil is notorious for having a complicated tax code, but again, it can be made much simpler with the right local partner. And how to set up local payments. Great. So hopefully we provided some good insight into that. If you guys have specific questions about these issues, please go ahead and get your questions in. We're almost to the Q&A, and of course, all of us will be available after the session to talk more in depth about these issues. Okay, and so just to finish up here, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, AMI has been very invested in this subject matter. So if this information was interesting to you, if it piqued your curiosity, if you'd like to know more, AMI has developed a report specifically aimed at helping merchants understand the Brazilian local context, and how to go to market. So we've developed this 72-page comprehensive report that really makes it easy. It breaks down Brazil's entire banking system in much more detail than we covered here, the description of local payment methods, how installments work, the various models for market entry that we discussed a little bit. You know, Martin mentioned that it's not always necessary to open a local entity. We discuss when and why you should or shouldn't open a local entity, and who are the players, including PayU, who are available to help you with that. And then most importantly, in the gray box here, we go over, you know, what are the different options merchants have when going to Brazil in terms of processing payments for both acquirers and companies like PayU and others. So if this was interesting to you, there you have the link to read the abstract and table of contents. We're going to also circulate all this material, so you'll have the direct link in your email. And of course, I'm available for questions about this or any other content we covered in the report. So this is all of our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to any of us for questions, doubts, clarifications, or if you just like more information. And unless Marcos or Martin, do you have any other comments before we go to the questions?
No, I think let's look at the questions. If there's no questions specifically of taxes, maybe we can also cover part two. At least I can give a few comments about it. But let's go for the questions.
Great. So I will open the floor up to Shelley, who's been hiding behind the scenes for us.
Hi, everyone. So I have a question, and the question is, does PayU connect directly to the local acquirers like Cielo Stone, or do they use a sub-acquirer like Mercado Pago?
We are connected directly to the main acquirers in Brazil. By the way, we do multi-acquire, which maximizes our approval rate. So we don't have any third party between us and the acquirer. So we are connected directly.
So we're connected, as Marco says, to 3 acquirers. So not just Cielo, and they're completely, we don't, as I said in the initial stages of the conversation, the 250 payment methods that we have, we connect directly. We don't use any third-party PSPs underneath, so yeah.
Yeah, and that's a...
Marcos, could you maybe... Sorry, go ahead, Lindsay.
Let me just interject really quickly. That's the kind of information that you'll see in this report that I just mentioned. You know, we have PayU as a highlighted company, and you'll see that they're connected directly to the acquirers that they mentioned. And you'll see companies where they may be connected via a third party. So it's really easy to differentiate, okay, which providers am I going to get the best contact, the best connection to the acquirers, and which ones is maybe the route going to be a little less direct.
Perfect. And Marcos, maybe could you explain real briefly what is multi-acquiring for those who aren't familiar with that?
Sure. We are connected to the main acquirers in Brazil, as we said. So we are connected, for example, with Rede, Cielo, GetNet, and others. And the idea here is to do a second attempt to the second acquirer when the transaction is rejected in the first one. So if we have a transaction that is rejected, we still have 2 or 3 attempts to approve this transaction depending on the response code we get from the first acquirer. So by doing that, we increase a lot the approval rates, which is very good. I would like to add as well that we do full service here. So we are connected to the acquirers. We have our own fraud management tool, and we provide a very in-depth reports that allow merchants to conciliate in a very good position. So we do everything for our merchants in the sense of payments.
Thank you. So another question I have is, how frequently can money be pulled out of Brazil, and what are the export tax fees?
It depends on the merchant. What we recommend is that this money should be remitted abroad no higher than weekly basis. You know, so the idea is at least weekly we should remit the money, not before the week, 2 times a week, 3 times a week, because it turns the process very expensive and very complex. So the idea is to use weekly basis or higher, bi-weekly or even monthly.
And just to add there, and I think we didn't cover this, but acquirers in Brazil pay merchants and us as a PSP D plus 30. They pay 30 days after the payment's been done, which is, I mean, for anyone else in the world, it's ludicrous. It's a lot of time. The US is D plus 1. In most countries, it's D plus 1, D plus 2. So we can remit the funds, just as Marco says, on a weekly basis. But then there's this financing cost there too. So some international merchants prefer to actually, when they know that the acquirers pay that way, they prefer us to pay them as an acquirer and not have to get into any financing costs too. But it really does depend on the merchant. So we're pretty flexible at allowing that. And regarding the taxes, so we're not tax advisors. So I think I'll cover that part too. But as the merchant's international, the taxes that apply, as it's not local, it doesn't actually have to go into tax regulations of the local entity because it hasn't got a local legal entity. Us as a PSP, what we've discovered, and this processing the payment, depending on the industry, there could be withholding taxes. All right, so the lowest withholding tax, this is for gaming clients, for instance, is just IOF, which is 0.38%. Okay. And then, depending on the industry of the merchant, that can go as high as about 35%. So it varies from 0.38, less than 0.5%, to about 35. And that's what we normally do with withholding taxes. I don't know if you want to add any additional point there, Michael, but
that's perfect, Martin.
Perfect. One more question on that same note, which is, assuming you pay U.S. merchants in U.S. dollars when you transfer the money or remit it, what exchange rate is used for those transmissions?
We use the exchange rate on the right day the remittance is done. And the bank we use here in Brazil is the one that provides this FX rate.
Perfect, thanks. And one more question, switching topics a little bit. The question is, how responsive is the market to sales, promotions, free trial offers? Marcos, can you talk a little bit about the market and the consumers in that regard?
I would say that Brazilians love promotions, you know? So everybody is really open to, to use these promotions, coupons, this is one kind of thing that really attracts us. Just an example, in our Black Friday, which happens in November, we have seen a huge growth year by year because due to the promotions that merchants in Brazil usually do. So the answer here is yes, Brazilians love promotions and you have a huge space to navigate in DC.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in there, Marcos. We did a case study, and I have some slides if anyone is interested in looking at them, kind of a different type of promotion that you might think. But Netshoes is one of the top e-commerce sites in Brazil, and they were seeing that their mobile penetration, their sales via the mobile channel were struggling and weren't growing very well. So what they did, they partnered up with the local telecoms to offer free navigation, free access to their website over the mobile channel, meaning that their customers are not going to be consuming data if they visit their site. They launched it around Black Friday in November, and the results were absolutely outstanding. Conversion, visits, and total sales exceeded the PC channel on mobile. So people, it just unlocked all of this demand that was very latent and just waiting for people to make purchases. So visits, conversion, and final sales all exceeded on mobile, all exceeded the PC channel, and the numbers were really impressive. So it's just a testament to how important mobile is and how important access to the mobile channel is. And when you are creative about the promotions you provide, not just on your own products, but access to your website, you know, it's merchant sponsored access, that can also exponentially affect your success.
We have time for one last question, or shall we respond to the rest of the questions after the webinar? I know it is a couple minutes over time.
I think we have a couple more, Shelley, in the question box here. I think we have time for one or two more.
All right, so a question is PayU service only relevant to U.S. businesses selling hard goods directly to Brazilian consumers? What about U.S. companies selling to Brazilian distributors? So the B2B side of the business.
Sure, I'll take that one if you want, Marcos, and you can add. But no, it's not just focused on consumers. It's definitely for B2B. We've got many B2B merchants as well. We've got the largest advertising, web advertising companies in the world. And they're really focused on the B2B side too. So no, it's not just focused on consumers.
Okay.
Perfect.
I think there's one more question here that I'll go ahead and read out. Let's see if I can read the whole thing. Oh, how receptive are Brazilians to recurring revenue models, and which payment methods are enabling this type of commerce?
That's an amazing question because we have seen.
That's on a lot of people's minds, definitely.
Yes, what we have seen here in Brazil is a kind of trend towards recurrent models. We have seen merchants offering from socks to subscriptions, you know, socks in a kind of subscriptions, you know, all sorts of products, not only the standard ones, including services such as Open English. So I think we have a huge space here in Brazil, even though we have seen some players in the market approaching this particular business mode.
Great. And so which payment methods are most relevant in the recurring revenue models? Like, is boleto feasible for recurring payments?
For recurrent payments, you know, basically credit cards are the most used since boleto becomes more complex on a monthly basis because it has to be paid every month. And in a recurrent for a recurrent business, it's not that the usage is very difficult. So credit cards are the most used for recurrent payments.
Okay.
So subscription-based models that we've seen, like Open English was an example, and Netflix, quite a few. You know, credit cards are the main thing for recurring payment methods. And in Brazil, it actually works very well. You can process without the CVV. You can do recurring payments. We get very good approval rates. But however, whoever's in a subscription-based model, they should look at the possibility of maybe doing a package of 6 months, 1 year prepaid, and then accessing Boleto Bancario. And that's what we've seen, that can still be 15 to 20% of the business.
Exactly. I've heard of merchants, you know, offering subscription model, adapting their model to offer prepaid to enable people who want to pay with boleto. That's a
we've even in some of the other markets that we've got to, we've even created cash payment options where you give them a specific card so that the user can go and pay on a monthly basis. So it's not a pull, it's a push system, but it really it's the closest we can get to doing cash payments and recurring payments with cash payments. So you just generate one unique code, and with that same code, they can go and pay every month.
Great. Okay, I think that's it. We've gone a little bit over time. I want to thank everyone for participating, for your attention, for taking time today to be with us. Again, please contact us, reach out. We have our emails there for any questions, any doubts, if you'd like any more information. Marcos, Martin, and Shelly, I want to thank you all very much for participating. And if there's nothing else, I guess we'll sign off.
Thank you very much, Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Lindsay,
presentation.
for being our host today.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.